I didn't ask for anyone's pity. I want to make that clear before I say anything else. When my father looked me in the eye and told me to get out of his house, I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just went upstairs, packed what fit into a duffel bag, and walked out the front door into a Tuesday evening in October. The kind of October that doesn't feel like fall yet, just like summer gave up. I was 19 years old. The reason, if you can call it that, was my boyfriend. Or more specifically, the fact that I had one. His name was Colton. He was 23, worked at a tire shop on Route 9, and my father decided within the first 10 minutes of meeting him that he was a waste of space. My father was not subtle about this. He said it directly at the dinner table in front of my mother, who looked at her plate the entire time and said nothing. That was always how it went in our house. My father spoke. My mother arranged her face into careful neutrality and stayed quiet. And I was supposed to do the same. I didn't. I told my father that Colton was kind, that he was the first person who had ever made me feel like I could breathe, and that I was going to keep seeing him. My father stood up from the table. He pointed at the door. He said, and I remember every single word, "If you choose that boy over this family, you leave tonight and you don't come back." My mother was still looking at her plate. I chose. I didn't have much. $412 in my checking account, a duffel bag with 2 weeks of clothes, and a name, Colton's, who I showed up at without calling first. He opened the door. He looked at my bag. He didn't say anything stupid like what happened. Or are you okay? He just stepped aside and let me in. That was the last act of real kindness I received for a long time. Colton and I lasted 8 months after that. Not because of anything dramatic. He wasn't cruel. He didn't cheat. He didn't steal. We just were two people who worked better as a reason to leave home than as an actual life together. When it ended, I was living in a studio in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, working double shifts at a diner on the weekends and a front desk job at a physical therapy clinic during the week. I was making just enough to stay above zero each month, not more than that. My parents did not call. Not once, not on my birthday. Not at Christmas, not when I sent a card the first year, trying. The card came back with "Return to sender" written in my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. He had the neatest handwriting of anyone I've ever known. He was very proud of that. I stopped sending cards after that. What I did instead was work. I worked in a way that I don't think most people understand unless they've done it. Not because you love what you do, not because you have some vision, but because stopping means you fall, and you cannot afford to fall. I took every shift I could get. I learned every software program the clinic used. When the office manager quit without notice, I told the director I could cover the role temporarily. Temporarily became permanently. The pay went up. I got health insurance for the first time since I was 19. I started taking community college courses at night. Business administration, accounting basics. I had a professor named Dr. Harmon, a woman in her 60s who wore the same cardigan in 3 different colors and had no patience for excuses, who told me after class one night that I had a real instinct for financial analysis. I didn't know what to do with that. I just kept showing up. By 24, I had an associate's degree and a job offer at a small accounting firm in Philadelphia. Entry level, barely above what I was making at the clinic. But it was different. It was the kind of job that had a future attached to it, and I had learned by then that that matters more than the number on the paycheck. I moved to Philadelphia in March. I knew exactly one person in the city, a woman named Simone, who I'd met at a conference, who had offered up her couch for 2 weeks while I found a place. She ended up being one of the most important people in my life. She was sharp in ways I was still learning to be. She asked me hard questions over cheap wine on her couch. What do you actually want? Not what do you need? What do you want? And I didn't have an answer for a long time. Eventually, I did. I wanted to never feel like I was one missed paycheck from losing everything. And I wanted to be the person making decisions, not the person implementing them. Those 2 things shaped the next 6 years of my life more than anything else. I passed my CPA exam at 26. I changed firms twice, not out of disloyalty, but because I had learned that your growth follows whoever challenges you most, and when a place stops challenging you, you've outgrown it. By 28, I was a senior associate. By 30, I was a manager with a book of clients that I had built myself, referral by referral, across 3 years of never missing a deadline and never letting a client feel like they didn't understand what I was doing with their money. I bought my condo at 31. A 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I had walked through during lunch breaks for 2 years before I could afford to live there. I remember the closing day very clearly. The notary handed me a stack of papers and told me to initial everywhere flagged in yellow. My hand was steady. I had been waiting for this moment since I was 19 years old, sitting on the curb outside my father's house with a duffel bag. I did not cry. I went home. My home, ordered Thai food, and sat on the floor of my empty living room because I didn't have furniture yet, and I just sat there for a while. That was not the end of hard things. I want to be honest about that. A year after I bought the condo, a client I had spent 18 months cultivating, a family-owned restaurant group, substantial account, discovered that their previous bookkeeper, a woman named Adrian who they'd employed for a decade, had been embezzling from them. Not enormous sums, but consistent ones, every month for 4 years. When it came out, they were looking for someone to blame for not catching it sooner. I was the most recent person who had touched their books. They threatened to file a complaint with the state board. I spent 6 weeks working with an attorney and pulling every document I had from our engagement. Every email, every signed scope of work letter, every communication where I had noted the limitations of a review versus a full audit. The complaint went nowhere because I had done everything right and I could prove it. But those 6 weeks cost me sleep. I haven't fully gotten back, and they cost me the account which they pulled regardless. Simone came over the night I got the final letter. She brought a bottle of wine that was significantly better than the cheap kind from our couch days. She sat across from me and said, "You're still standing." I was. Barely felt like it. But I was. What that experience did, and I didn't understand this until later, was radicalize me about documentation, about being unimpeachable, about making sure that every single thing I did professionally was so clearly recorded that no one could ever again point a finger at me and have it stick. I became, if anything, more methodical, more precise. Clients noticed. They referred others. The book grew back, and then some. I was 33 when my phone rang on a Thursday afternoon in November. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer. I was between meetings and I had 40 minutes to eat something before the next one. I answered. It was my mother. She sounded older, not fragile. My mother had never been fragile. I think she simply performed softness around my father because it was safer. But older in the way people sound when years have accumulated in ways they weren't prepared for. She said my name. She said she was sorry to bother me. She asked if I had a moment. 14 years. She was asking if I had a moment. I said yes. She told me my father had retired 2 years ago. She told me he had been sick. Not terminal, she was careful to say not terminal, but significant. A cardiac event the previous spring that had changed things. She told me that they had moved from the house I grew up in to a smaller place. And then, carefully, she told me that they would very much like to see me. I held the phone and did not speak for a long enough period that she said my name again. I said, "I'll think about it." I did not say it cruelly. I said it because it was true, and because it was the most honest thing I could offer her in that moment. She said she understood. She gave me her new number. She said she hoped to hear from me. I put my phone down and went to my next meeting. Here is what I have never told anyone about what happened after that call. I went home that night and I sat in the same spot on my living room floor where I had sat after closing on the condo, except now there was furniture, and I pulled my knees up and I just thought. For a very long time, I had built a life, a real one, a substantial one, a life that no one had given me or helped me into. I had built it from the ground up with nothing but the willingness to keep going when stopping would have been so much easier, and somewhere in the years of doing that, I had stopped expecting anything from my parents. I had stopped being angry. I had simply moved on. Not forgiven? Not exactly, because forgiveness implies some active event, and I'm not sure that's how it works. But moved on. So why was I sitting on my floor again? Because she had sounded old. Because 14 years is a long time. Because some part of me, and I did not like this part, I want to be clear. Some part of me had been waiting for the phone to ring for 14 years and just never admitted it. I did not call back right away. I took 3 weeks. I talked to Simone. I talked to my therapist, whom I had started seeing at 29 and who had the patience of someone who had made a career out of other people's complicated relationships with their parents, which is to say considerable. They both, in different ways, said the same thing: whatever you decide, make sure it's a decision you're making, not one that's being made for you. I called my mother back in December. We talked for 40 minutes. It was careful, both of us. It was the way people talk when they have been strangers for long enough that they have to relearn the syntax of the other person. She told me more about my father's health. She told me about my younger brother, Wesley. Yes, the one who had stayed, who had gone to college on my father's money and come out the other side into a life that looked like the one my parents had scripted for both of us, and how he was living in Denver now with his wife and their 2 daughters. She told me that my father had asked about me. That stopped me. I said, "What do you mean he asked about me?" She said he had been asking for a while. Since the cardiac event. She said, and her voice did something strange here, like it was trying to stay even and not quite managing. She said he had told her he'd made a mistake. About me. About what he'd done. I did not know what to do with that either. I agreed to meet them. Not at their home. I was not ready for that, and I said so, and to her credit she didn't push. We met at a restaurant in a city halfway between where I lived and where they had moved. A neutral place. I drove myself. I wore a blazer that I had bought for a client presentation and felt, in some abstract way, like armor. My father looked small. That is the only word I have for it. He had been a large man when I was growing up. Not physically enormous, but large in the way that fills a room, large in the way that makes you feel like there is no oxygen left once he's decided something. And he sat across from me in that restaurant and he looked small. Older, a little diminished around the edges. He had the same eyes. That was the strangest part. Everything else had shifted and the eyes were exactly the same. We ordered food that none of us really ate. We talked around things for a while in the way that families do when the real conversation is sitting in the middle of the table and everyone is pretending it isn't. And then my father put down his fork and looked at me directly and said, "I was wrong. I want you to know that I know I was wrong." 14 years collapsed into about 3 seconds. I had imagined this moment before. In the early years, I had imagined it often. I imagined saying devastating things. Or I imagined weeping, or I imagined feeling some enormous relief that untied something inside me. In the actual moment, sitting across from my father in a mid-priced restaurant in a city that was not mine, I felt something much quieter than any of that. I felt something that was close to tired, the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after something has finally, irrevocably ended. I said, "I know you do." I didn't say it's okay. Because it wasn't, not entirely, and lying to him in that direction did not feel like something either of us deserved. But I also didn't say all the things I had stored for years because I had already spent them, alone, in therapy, in the long interior work of building a life that did not need his approval to be real. I had already said all of it, just not to him. My mother cried. Quietly, into her napkin. My father did not cry. He is not a man who cries. But he kept looking at me in a way that had nothing performative in it. And after a while I understood that this was, for him, the equivalent. We stayed at that restaurant for almost 3 hours. I drove home alone that night and I thought about who I had been at 19, scared, broke, dragging a duffel bag out of a house where I had never felt entirely real. And who I was now. The distance between those 2 people was not luck. It was not talent exactly. It was accumulated decision after accumulated decision to keep going, to learn one more thing, to refuse to let the story that someone else had written for me become the one I actually lived. My parents and I see each other now, a few times a year. It is not the relationship I might have had if none of this had happened. I don't know what that relationship would have looked like, and I've stopped trying to imagine it because I think that's a grief that doesn't serve me. What we have is something we built out of the ruins of what we broke, and it is careful and it is real and it is, I think, more honest than what came before. My father has never once told me what to do since we started talking again. I don't know if he learned it or if he simply no longer has the authority in his own mind to do it, But either way, it's a different thing between us now. My mother sent me a card last spring, for my birthday. Just a card, nothing expensive. From one of those displays in a grocery store, she had written inside it, in her own handwriting, not something printed, that she was proud of me. That she had always been proud of me, even when she hadn't said so. That she was sorry it had taken her so long to say it out loud. I put the card on my kitchen counter. It stayed there for 2 weeks before I moved it somewhere else. I'm not entirely sure where it is now, which I think means I've absorbed it rather than needing to display it. I think about the girl who packed that duffel bag sometimes. Not with pity. I'm done with pity, given and received, but with something closer to respect. She didn't know how it would turn out. She didn't have a plan. She just walked out the door because staying would have cost her something she couldn't name yet but knew she couldn't afford. She was right. The life on the other side of that door was harder than anything she could have imagined, and it was entirely hers. That is the only thing I would not trade. Not the condo, not the career, not the Cambo license on my office wall. The fact that every single piece of it, every single piece I built myself. No one gave it to me. No one can take it back. You can throw someone out into the cold and think you've ended something. What you don't know is that the cold sometimes teaches people things the warm house never could. I don't need my father's approval to know that. I never did. I used to think the hardest part of what happened to me was the night I walked out with that duffel bag. The cold air, the sound of the door closing behind me, the 43 steps to the end of the driveway that I counted without meaning to. For a long time, that was the image I carried. 19 years old, $400, nowhere to go. But the hardest part wasn't that night. The hardest part was every ordinary Tuesday after it. The shifts I didn't want to take, the classes I sat through exhausted, the moments when I could have stopped, when stopping would have been so much easier, and I chose not to. Nobody sees those moments. Nobody gives you credit for them. You just do them, and they add up, and eventually they become a life. What I know now that I didn't know then is that how you respond to being wronged matters more than the wrong itself. My father made a decision rooted in pride and control. He chose his idea of what my life should look like over the actual person I was. That was his failure, and it was a real one. But what happened next? That was mine to determine. I could have let his rejection become my ceiling. A lot of people do. They let the wound define the limit, and everything they build afterwards stays small enough to fit inside the damage. I refused to do that, not because I was particularly brave, but because I was stubborn, and because somewhere underneath the fear, I had a very clear sense that the story wasn't over. Colton and I didn't make it. Adrian nearly took my career down with her mess. There were years that were genuinely bleak in ways I don't fully describe even to people I trust. But I kept learning. I kept making the next decision and then the next one. And I didn't wait for anyone to hand me permission. Simone asked me once, over that cheap wine in the early Philadelphia days, what I would do if my parents never apologized. I thought about it for a real moment, and then I said I'd be fine. She looked at me like she wasn't sure she believed me. Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure I believed myself. But I think now that the answer was actually true, and the reason it was true is that I had stopped building my life toward them. I had started building it towards something that was entirely mine. When that shift happens, when you stop needing the person who hurt you to validate your recovery, something opens up. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something that functions better than bitterness. The day my father said he was wrong, I didn't feel triumph. I want to be honest about that because I think a lot of people expect that moment to feel like winning. It felt like exhaustion, the good kind, like putting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. He couldn't give me back 14 years. He couldn't undo the miscarriage of a relationship that should have been something else. What he could do was tell the truth finally, and he did. And I chose to let that be enough, not for him, for me. That's the thing nobody tells you about building a life from nothing. The discipline it requires doesn't leave you when the hardship ends. It becomes the way you move through everything. I am more precise, more clear-eyed, more deliberate than I would have been if I had stayed in that house and let my father's version of my future play out. The cold taught me things the warmth never would have, and I would not trade that. Not for anything he could have given me then, not for anything he can offer now. You are always the one deciding what the story means. That's the only authority no one can take from you.